Hi, my name is Jeffrey Lewis, and I do some things which are educational, and I had some debate with a close personal relation of mine about whether my Fred talk ought to be what I do, which is sort of educational sometimes, or about how I do what I do, which is educational if you're interested in how I do what I do, but doesn't really have that many applications outside of that. So I suppose I'll demonstrate a little of both, and maybe there'll be something interesting in that somewhere, hopefully. So what I do is sometimes I make music available at a store near you for some outrageous price, and sometimes I make comic books, and sometimes I combine the two elements of art and music into these things that I call low-budget videos, which literally started out as being low-budget videos which I would bring into my concerts and be singing while I'm showing these images. And some of them that I would show in my concerts over the years were fiction, and some of them were non-fiction. I started to do a series on the history of communism in song form with illustrations, and somehow this led to me doing some work for the History Channel, in which they once in a while send me an historical topic, or a historical topic, depending on whether you pronounce the H. And they provide me with zero input. They just say, we need by October 20th an illustrated song on Marco Polo, or on something or other, usually something that I know nothing about. And I suppose I will start by just showing one of these things, which is educational, and then I will talk about how I make these things, which is maybe educational, but not as interesting, sort of, or more, depending on your perspective. So, okay, so this is the French Revolution. The King of France was absolute, the people all were destitute. The year was 1789. Churches paid no income tax, neither did aristocrats, and wars were costing money all the time. But Enlightenment ideas had entered people's ears, like liberty, equality, and brotherhood. People starving broke under feudalism's yoke, knew no church or king was gonna do them any good. There was such financial crisis, the king had to take advice to try an old thing called the States General Government. The States General had three votes, nobles, church, and common folks. 2 to 1, the commons lose, it always went. The commons in frustration said, we represent the nation. The nobles and the church must lose their privileges. And the rich were scared for real when they stormed to the Bastille, and rebellions also broke out in the villages. At the palace in Versailles, the king and queen were heard to sigh when the National Assembly made a Bill of Rights. Then the Women's March embarrassed them and chased them into Paris, and the church and nobles lost their power overnight. Arguments got hot whether to keep a king or not. Different groups saw different ways to run the country best. But when the royal family tried to flee the country in disguise, they were busted and then put under a house arrest. All of Europe's kings were terrified to hear these things, so France was threatened on all sides by enemies. And when these other kings declared the king of France had to be spared, this made the king of France look worse to the revolutionaries. They had built a new machine, the quick and painless guillotine. They said much fairer than the king's medieval torture rack. And they put it to a vote, and then they dropped it on his throat. And every king across the world just had a heart attack. And they attacked from north and south, and they attacked from east and west. So revolutionary France was in a desperate state. And when the radical Marat was killed politically, now that was what it took for France's outlook to degenerate. The new leader, Robespierre, said enemies were everywhere, and for a year the guillotine was working endlessly. And though he freed the slaves, it's crew Robespierre's had came home too. Then France was run by the more moderate Directory. But the Directory was lame, and France's only good news came from their armies out in Europe winning more and more. And the man who made them win was General Napoleon, but when he came back home he made himself the emperor. So it was a painful climb to get from kings to modern times, but the French Revolution always paved the way, cause the ideas that sparked it first have never been reversed. It was the biggest change that shaped our Western world today.
Okay, so that was the finished product, or not actually the finished product, that was the finished music and art. What ends up going up on the History Channel is a filmed performance of that. So I'm going to take you through the steps that lead from the blank screen of my uneducated brain through to the final footage that ends up with the History Channel. I get an email one day, do such and such topic, blah blah blah, by November 10th, Marco Polo. So I've taken it upon myself to develop the habit of, before I do any one of these topics, to take note of what I already know about the topic, because when I do that, I find it's really entertaining for myself to look back on that after I'm done and realize how I was totally misinformed on everything that I thought I knew. So I said, Marco Polo, okay, let me just, for the sake of amusement, what do I think I know about Marco Polo? And he was Italian, and he went to China or something like that, and he brought back noodles to Italy, maybe? He introduced Italy to pasta, and this was probably around the Middle Ages. It was medieval times. It was maybe what led to the Renaissance, because he brought new knowledge to Europe. That was the extent of my knowledge of Marco Polo, and as usual, afterwards I looked back and realized that I was totally wrong on all counts, and that applying this to everything else I think I know about the world, I'm probably completely wrong and misinformed on everything. But now I know about Marco Polo. So, how do I know about Marco Polo? Well, the first thing I do is read the Wikipedia page, of course. So, I read the Wikipedia page, and then I start sort of trawling the internet for any and all stuff I can find about Marco Polo, short of actually going to the library and getting a book about Marco Polo, because that seems like more trouble than I can be bothered with, apparently. In desperate cases, I do actually refer to books. And I like to find any movies I can possibly watch. It's basically it's like a homework assignment in which the teacher does not care at all how you got your information. I'm not asked to cite any sources. I'm never rejected in what I hand into them. Nobody says you got this wrong or that wrong. It's as if they don't know anything about the topic and they're asking me to tell them. So the first thing I discovered was that there is, apparently, so I said to myself, great, I'll just watch this movie and then I'll know the story. It'll take me a couple hours and then I'll know the whole story. Start at the bottom and then I can get to work on the art. So unfortunately, as my girlfriend and I were watching this movie, we realized that it was total bullshit very quickly. As evidenced by the fact that Kublai Khan, the emperor of China, the Mongolian emperor of Asia, is played by Brian Dennehy. So,
every other Asian person is played by an Asian actor.
Yeah. And making no attempt whatsoever to sound like anything other than a guy in Queens who is like about to be like, and Marco, let's discuss this over a couple of hot dogs or something. He really had no
it was so bizarrely, completely inappropriate. It was as though they were daring somebody. It was like the Emperor's New Clothes, or it was as though you were playing Lady Macbeth and like expecting somebody not to notice. It was, so we didn't even make it through the whole movie. I had to take the desperate move of actually reading some books and some other websites and things like that. But at least the film gave me a sense of what the period looked like, what the costumes might look like, because everybody involved in the film, theoretically, I guess, had to do some research on what they looked like. So why should I have to do the research when I can just refer to what they already researched? After I've compiled a huge, sloppy, non-chronological text document grabbed from all sorts of sources on the web, some of which conflict with each other, I've got this huge, sloppy document full of different fonts and different sizes, copied and pasted from everywhere that I can find information. And then I boil it all down to, I aim for a 20-sentence description of the story, top to bottom, the who, what, when, where, how, why, and a story with some kind of satisfying beginning, middle, and end that encompasses why it's important to us now, why it was important then, blah, blah, blah. And I aim for telling the story in 20 sentences. I'll allow myself to go to 24 if I can't condense it further. And in this case, I did go to 24. So the story of Marco Polo, I boiled down to chronologically, point one, in the 13th century, civilizations had developed a lot, but travel between these civilizations was minimal. Two, there was a lot of trade on the so-called Silk Road, but it wasn't for like traveling all the way from one end of the road to the other. It was just a lot of little kind of trading posts along the way, and nobody went all the way from one end to the other. The goods could travel. Point three, in the West, Europe had the Roman Empire and the eastern part of the Roman Empire, and then all the way in the east, China had the massive Mongolian Empire, which was twice as big as the Roman Empire. Who knew? So once I have the story to my own satisfaction, told in 20 to 24 sentences, because each one of these sentences is going to need to turn into an illustration, and the entire song and illustration is going to need to fit into a 3-minute or less format. Once I've got it boiled down to 20 points, comes the really hard part of the whole thing, which is turning this into a song, a 24-line song. And, for example, from the outline, turning into lyrics, I start with in the outline, points 4, 5, 6. Marco Polo was born around Venice around 1254. His father and uncle were merchants, and when Marco Polo was 6, his father and uncle left for the east. Now, turning that into lyrics that rhyme and fit into a melodic and rhythmic structure is a lot of revision and frustration and crossing out and starting again, and these 2 lines probably took maybe 5 hours of work to turn from that into that. So this ended up being, Marco Polo was born in the city of Venice in 1254, a rich merchant man's son. When Marco was little, his father and uncle went trading much further than most men had done. So just getting all those beats in place, condensing the information so that no syllable is wasted, is the hard part. Then, after I've spent a long time doing that, I turn it into these beautiful, crappy illustrations where I've got pretty much on whatever scrap paper is around my house, etching out, pass them around, or, I don't know, wipe sweat from your brow with them. They are extremely illegible, perhaps, but a lot of thought does go into composing how I get each lyric into an image of those dimensions. For example, I'm going to look at this image here, and the image that it ended up turning into in its finished form. So here, I, with each page, try to compose the page visually as if you were reading a page of text. So this lyric, which is, what the hell is this line? When Romans ruled Europe and Mongols ruled China, neither one still knew much of the opposite side. So I try to compose the page so that you're reading it like a page of text. So when Romans ruled Europe and Mongols ruled China, neither one, well, it's easier if you see the finished drawing. So that's what it turns into. And It's when Romans ruled Europe and Mongols ruled China. Neither one still knew much of the opposite side. So you're sort of seeing the image as though your eye was moving through a page of text. I find that works better. And the original sketch, I might have originally had the question marks sort of above their head, but then I realized that happens later in the sentence, so I put it below. I think I had the Mongolian looking across with a telescope, and then I realized that maybe they didn't have those. So it ends up being that, and I usually force my girlfriend to color in, help me with the coloring, and we go through pack after pack of Crayola crayons in my apartment. I've got a huge amount of packs of Crayolas that, all the good colors have been used up and all the colors that I don't need are still sitting there. Most of the time, I have noticed that although I've done a lot of these, they're never about black people. So all of my white flesh-colored crayons go really fast, and I've got all these brown crayons that never get used. So I'm always having to buy new packs just for the white flesh. I'm sure at some point in the future they may realize this at history and assign me to tell the story of the Harlem Renaissance or the Underground Railroad, there's a lot of things that are interesting to me, and I'm not sure if it's my place to suggest it to them. Anyway, so now after I've got all of these illustrations compiled into this book form, I go through, and because this won't fit on a scanner, it's too large for a scanner, I take digital photos of all the pages, crop them, size them, color adjust, and put them all in iMovie, along with a very quick acoustic demo recording of the song, and I send that on to the History Channel for approval. Now, like I say, they have never not approved anything that I've done, even when certain things were blatantly wrong.
So thousands of years, trading routes have developed. We call it the Silk Road, 2 continents wide. But when Romans ruled Europe and Mongols ruled China, neither one still knew much of the opposite side. Marco Polo was born in the city of Venice in 1254, a rich merchantman's son. When Marco was little, his father and uncle went trading much further than most men had done. The brothers came home after 9 years of travels.
Okay, so I send that little demo video on to History Channel. They say, that's great, perfect, on to the next one. And I say to myself, well, I don't really trust that that's perfect. I would rather get the opinion of an expert. So I track down the guy who wrote this book that I sort of skimmed through on Marco Polo. He's a professor named Lawrence Bergerine, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, and he lives in New York City, and he was kind enough to give me his input, and he actually told me that a couple of the pages were somewhat erroneous. I had a couple of lines about how Marco is doubted by people who point out that Marco Polo never mentions in his book the Great Wall of China. He doesn't mention Chinese drinking of tea, which would have been a big part of their culture supposedly. He doesn't mention foot binding, and people use this as evidence that Marco was never actually in China, that he made it up or heard it from other people in his travels, not as far east as he claimed to have gone. And there's another piece of evidence against him, which is that Chinese history never mentions Marco at all, even though Chinese history is very detailed, supposedly, on encounters with outsiders. So this professor, this very learned academic expert on Marco Polo, told me that, in fact, current scholarship agrees that Marco was out east, and I shouldn't concentrate so much on that part. And so I took those pages out, spent another 5 hours writing one more stupid lyric about how he probably was out there. So, so then what happens is I then arrange with History to film a performance of the piece. In this case, they wanted to shoot this one in Tompkins Square Park, and because I'm flipping the pages of the book while I'm singing, I can't play the guitar, and I got Damien Quinones to play the guitar, and I was lucky enough to get Ernie Brooks from the Modern Lovers to play bass, and so what I then get is this is a preview of what ends up being used. Well, we're going to start off by going all the way back back to the Middle Ages and the story of Marco Polo. It goes like this. For thousands of years, trading routes had developed. We call it the Silk Road, 2 continents wide. But when Romans ruled Europe and Mongols ruled China, neither one still knew much of the opposite side. Marco Polo was born in the city of Venice in 1254, a rich merchantman's son. When Marco was little, his father and uncle went trading much further than most men had done. The brothers came home after 9 years of travels. They told Marco the wondrous places they'd gone. They planned to go back to trade more goods and knowledge with their new friend, the local Mongol Emperor Kublai Khan. So Marco went with them back east on their mission. When the journey began, he was just 17. Through Persia, past mountains and the vast Gobi Desert, he saw things that few Europeans had seen. When 3 years had passed, they had made it to China. They gave Kublai Khan a few presents they brought. The Khan was impressed with this young man named Marco, and the Polos were treated like lords in court. Marco was shocked. They used paper for money, and coal, which he thought was a rock that could burn. The Khan's postal service was also a wonder that Marco would tell Europe on his return. For 17 years through the empire, Marco had many jobs straight from the emperor himself. But the Khan grew quite old and the Polos got worried. The next Khan might not let them leave with their wealth. Finally, they got permission to leave it. It was a hard journey home, both by land and by sail. Home in Venice, Marco joined the war against Genoa, got captured and spent a year in jail. In jail, Marco met Rustichello, a writer. He heard Marco's stories and wrote them all down. This book became famous and read across Europe, even just with hand copies to get it around. Although they loved it, few people believed it. Some called it the Millions or 1 Million Lies. It is likely that Rustichello or others inserted or altered some stories inside. All true or not, all the book's great descriptions stirred Europe to wonder and want to learn more. All true or not, often much later travelers found proof of the things Marco said long before. Despite people's doubts, it inspired Columbus and others who journeyed for knowledge or gold. Marco himself never left home again, but to the end he still swore he'd see more than he told. After I see that, I send them a whole list of things that need to be corrected, like vocal flubs that I'm not going to need to go in and re-record overdubs, and places where they focus on the wrong part of the page when I'm talking about a different part of the page, and hopefully they make those corrections, and then it's finished. So that's it.
Do you want to take questions, or?
I'm sure people would love to hear more about this fascinating process.
Do you have a new topic?
Yeah, there's always new topics. The Renaissance was the most recent one that I did.
How do you reduce the Renaissance into 24th century?
That's the hard part. Thank you. Well, I mean, basically, following that exact same process. Just reading the Wikipedia. I always joke that like my job is to make the Wikipedia page rhyme, and that I feel like I'm part of this whole Culture for Dummies movement. But being a dummy myself, I'm glad to be learning some culture from it. Well, here, since you're a glutton for punishment, they're quick, 2.5 minutes. Here's the story of the Renaissance.
Can you say again where they're broadcast?
Well,
Or are
I was hoping nobody was going to ask me that because it sounds a whole lot better to say that they're for the History Channel. They are, but it's for the History Channel website. So it's not actually broadcast, but they're on the History Channel website along with a whole lot of other stuff, which is far more professional looking. I'm not really sure who watches these, but I think it's probably just an interesting change of pace for them, maybe.
It's on history.com.
do they appear in the form of you standing in Willoughby Tompkins Square Park?
Yeah, I kind of think I like it better when you don't see me at all, when you just see the art and hear the song rather than see me performing it, because I think it's more about the content than it is about me. But the guy who's in charge of this stuff for History Channel so far has preferred it being about the performance of it, which I guess there's a certain charm in seeing that it's just a ragged pad of paper with some crayons. So here's the Renaissance one. This is just a demo version. I improved the lyrics somewhat since this, and I also, I don't know, the flow. This is like a sort of rough version, but here you go.
The Renaissance is what we call the scientific and cultural stir-up that hit 15th century Europe. Long since the glory days of Rome, 1,000 years of Christendom had passed, ignoring the achievements of the past. But from medieval crusading and from increased merchant trading, they saw other cultures that knew way more. The idea their own age was dark grew with Italy's Petrarch, suggesting that the ancients were interesting. He said early Rome and ancient Greece were pagan, but with lots to teach if we listen. They were great even though they weren't Christian. Plus popes looked bad in the schism, so a new idea called humanism grew. That achievements outside church can be holy too. The works of Plato and ancient Athens started coming back in fashion, given new worth. Classical thinking had a rebirth. The first statue since antiquity to show naked anatomy was the David that Donatello in Florence created. And almost by coincidence, around that time, two more events changed art. Both oil painting and perspective start. Paint used to use eggs to mix, but oil let new effects exist, so Van Eyck started painting things more lifelike. An architect named Brunelleschi's mathematical perspective invention now helped flat art show the third dimension. Once thought of as just simple skills, now artwork looked like miracles. So artists' glory rose in public to the genius category. This shift was helped in Italy by patrons like the Medici, whose businesses could outweigh the old influences. By 1450, another strange invention made the whole world change. The printing press spread new ideas all through the West. Some said the spread of knowledge can make a so-called Renaissance man who learns all there is in all the arts and sciences. Soon Da Vinci and Michelangelo and others let their aspirations grow to try to be perfect in every medium they worked with. In medicine and philosophy, in religion and astronomy, the Renaissance set new standards all at once. Freedom from the church had brought a scientific way of thought and values that led to the ones we now use. It's ironic that change so drastic started from trying to be classic. The rebirth led into the modern world instead.
So when was it that was it when history contacted you to do a historical subject that you started kind of combining the songwriting with the art and the historical perspective, or is that just something you've always been a fan of?
I had been doing these illustrated songs for a number of years before that, and I started doing historical songs when I started doing ones about like music history. I was like, oh, well, the record label that I'm on, which is Rough Trade Records, had some kind of 25th anniversary show a few years ago, and I thought, oh, I should do one of my illustrated songs to tell the history of Rough Trade Records. And then I was like, wow, I could do that for a bunch of different indie record labels. So I did a history of K Records and a history of The Fall, and then I started thinking that I was doing so much indie rock about indie rock or music about music that it seemed like I really was limiting what I could do, and I was like, let me tackle a topic of vast social importance. So I thought I would do the complete history of communism. So that's been something I've been working on for years now. I've got like 7 chapters of it done, and I suppose somewhere along the way, somebody at History Channel who was in charge of finding new audiovisual content for their website either knew my stuff or was made aware by somebody else, and they said, because I was already doing these historical things. But doing this job has actually made me a lot better at it because of the strictness of the time. I think they work so much better in 2 to 3 minutes, and that forces me to just condense them and make them, I mean, some of the communism history ones are just kind of like 6 minutes or 7 minutes each. You know, I've got like a 6-minute one on communism in China, and it just sort of goes on and on. You wouldn't think I could go on and on.
Has your process changed very much from when you started doing that? You know, now that you've done a series of them and your learnings from each one of those, has that changed very much between them?
Yeah, I'm a lot better at it now, and the fact that these I've got a pretty tight deadline on, it's definitely gotten my process a lot tighter. I kind of have a working method that really seems to work for me, and realizing that I could make my girlfriend help me color helps.
So History.com really wasn't or hasn't been doing any fact checking on, did you mention that?
Seemingly not. The one time that they did correct a couple of them. One was I had made up a word that I thought was just kind of a fun Dr. Seussy, that it would be fun to stretch for a rhyme, to kind of rhyme with, I forget what it was. It was something about, you know, a Roman emperor. It wasn't going to be possible for him to oversee all these projects, so there was some word like impossibilism or something that was my stretch for a rhyme, and they were like, their comment was, we don't think this is a real word. So it was like totally humorless, and so I changed the line. It's a couple of things like that, but no, I don't know. I mean, maybe I would love to having like an expert give me input. It makes me feel so much better about them, because it does make me feel like somebody has actually made sure that I'm getting it right. Because any one of these topics, somebody could study for a really long time and become an actual expert who has the authority to tell other people about it. I don't feel like it's problematic for me to feel like I am that authority suddenly for every single topic in the world. But yeah, they seem to have shockingly little oversight. Well, thank you for listening.